Shalom, everyone. This is Chris Shoemaker, also known as Yehuda Ben Shomer, and welcome to another edition of Get Back to the First Century. Today, I want to talk about, has the law been done away with? And to get into this topic, we need to first ask ourselves, what is the law? The Christianity has its own perception of what the law is, and for the most part, they give the law a negative connotation. They perceive it as a bondage, as a hindrance, as a temporal thing until Messiah came to do away with it and to fulfill it all and to bring something better about. So let's look at the original languages and understand what the law means in the context of the scripture as well as to the Jewish and Messianic Jewish believer. So the law is considered in Judaism to be the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The word law comes from the Hebrew word Torah, and law is a correct translation of the word Torah, but a more precise and a more accurate translation for this Hebrew word Torah is instructions. And instructions doesn't sound as threatening or as intimidating as the word law. The law carries a fear and a weight to it. Instructions carries a positive connotation that, oh, we're going to learn what to do and how to do it. So has God done away with his law? A lot of people would say, yes, the law has been done away with. But if we ask ourselves the same question, but switch the words to the alternate translation, has God done away with his instructions? Has God done away with his holy instructions to us? Let me read to you Colossians 2:14. It says, blotting out the handwritten ordinance that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. People have interpreted this passage to say that the law was nailed to the cross. But is this really true? Is this what it says? I think if we read carefully the Aramaic and the Greek in regards to this passage, we will discover that it wasn't the law that was nailed to the cross, but it was the penalty of the law, the penalty of breaking and disregarding the holy commandments and instructions of God. It was the penalty of the law which was nailed to the cross and done away with, not the laws and instructions itself. So what is the penalty of breaking the law? In many cases, it's death. So the death penalty against breaking the law and against breaking and disregarding God's instructions, that is what was nailed to the cross, not the law itself. So the law/instructions has not been done away with. If the Torah has been done away with, that would make God out to be, number one, a liar, because Numbers 23:19 and Titus 1:2 says, it is impossible for God to lie. Now, God said over and over, in regards to the law, in regards to his instructions, he says these are ordinance forever, not these are ordinance until the Messiah comes. These are instructions until the Messianic age comes. No, he says that these are commandments and statutes forever, for all generations. So if the law and the instructions of God has truly been done away with, that would make God out to be a liar. And we know that the scriptures tell us that he, as well as Yeshua, his son, is the same always, yesterday, today, and forever, according to Malachi 3:6 and Hebrews 13:8. If the laws and instructions had been done away with, this would not only make God a liar, but this would also make God double-minded. The Brit Chadasha, the renewed covenant, talks about the New Testament, in other words, talks about one who is double-minded and says that they are unstable in all that they do, according to James 1:8. We know that God is not unstable. We know that God is not double-minded. We know that God is not a liar. Therefore, God's laws and God's instructions have not been done away with. So let us explore some of the controversial topics in regards to the law and the New Testament, or otherwise the Brit Chadasha, the renewed covenant, specifically the Pauline letters, the letters of Rav Shaul, because he talks about the curse of the law, he talks about being under the law, he talks about works of the law. So we had just established that the death penalty of disobeying God's instructions in the law has been nailed to the cross, not the Torah itself. So what is the curse of the law? The curse of the law is death. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 28, it talks about the blessings and the cursings. The blessings is if you obey God's laws, God's instructions, and the curses if you do not obey God's laws and God's instructions. So the curse of the law many times is death. So what does under the law mean? The same thing. Under the law means being under the penalty of the law, which is the curses, which is the death in regards to disobedience to his instructions. Now, a tricky phraseology is works of the law. What is works of the law? Works, meaning works towards an end, life or death. In other words, you can't earn your salvation by works. And also works of the law also means, and predominantly means, a sect's particular interpretation of how to abide by, walk out, adhere to, and obey the laws of God. So works of the law is more dealing with what the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, would call halakha, the way one walks out the Torah and the instructions and the commandments and laws of God. And this differs with every denomination and sect within Judaism and Messianic Judaism. Everybody has a different way of fulfilling the commandments. As you've probably heard many times before, as the old saying goes, there's more than one way to skin a cat. So there's more than one way to fulfill a commandment. God gives us a general overview saying, I want you to do this, but many times he doesn't specifically tell us or show us how to do this particular thing. And so that is left up to the interpretation of the leaders of a particular denomination and sect. So there's many traditions and customs on how to obey and to fulfill the laws of God. So this is what works of the law means. Moving on, let's make clear, very plain and clear, that the law is not a bondage as it is mostly deemed and hailed in the majority of Christendom. So let's ask yourself, what kind of God would rescue a nation, Israel, the children of Israel? What kind of God would rescue a nation from physical bondage of Egyptian slavery just to place them in a spiritual form of bondage? So if the law is a bondage, God took Israel out of physical slavery and bondage in Egypt, placed them in the wilderness, and put them under a spiritual bondage of the law. That makes absolutely no sense. That makes God out to be a cruel and sadistic God, a manipulative and controlling God. So the law is not a bondage. That would not be the kind of God that I would want to serve, that took a people out from physical bondage only to place them under a spiritual bondage. That makes no sense. So the law is not a bondage. So then what is true bondage? What is bondage? If bondage is not the law, if bondage is not the Torah, what is it? Romans 7:14 says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of flesh, sold into the bondage of sin." Sold into bondage to sin. So sin is the bondage. So now we've got to define what sin is. What is sin? 1 John 3:4. Whoever commits sin transgresses also the Torah, transgresses also the law. For sin is a transgression of the Torah. Sin is a transgression of the law. So the very definition of sin is breaking the Torah, breaking God's laws, breaking God's commandments, disregarding God's instructions. So that is sin, and we've established in Romans 7:14 that true bondage is sin. Moving on, as we just established what the biblical definition of sin is, let's continue on. Let's talk about man-made bondages. The bondage spoken of in the New Testament or the renewed covenant is not talking about Torah, the law, God's instructions, but about additions to the Torah, additions to the law. God is deeming additions, man-made customs and traditions and additions to the law of God itself as bondages. These are man-made bondages. These are the traditions of doctrines of men and of demons, according to Colossians 2:8, 1 Timothy 13:9, which were added, as we see in Mark chapter 7, verses 9 through 13, Deuteronomy 4:2, 12:32, Revelation 22:18 through 19. This is by men raised raising their customs and traditions and additions to the law, raising it to the level and authority of God's divine commandments, God's divine law and instructions, raising their own customs and traditions to the level of Torah itself. Yeshua agreed with the Pharisees in all points except for divorce, Matthew 19:19, and traditions elevated to Torah status, Mark 7:1-13. So let's read that. It says, Then came together unto him the Pharisees and certain scribes which came from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of his disciples eating bread with defiled hands, that is to say, unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they washed their hands oft, eat not, holding to the tradition of the elders. So we see this ritual of hand washing before eating. Hey, it's good hygiene, but it was a religious ritual based on the priestly dictate, mandate, and commandment for the priest to wash their hands before they sacrifice, before they partake of anything holy. And so their custom and tradition of hand washing for the common people was raised to the level of Torah. They thought that their tradition was just as valid and enforceable and just as much of a requirement as any commandment of the Torah itself. And it says, And when they come from the market, except they wash, they eat not. And many other things be there, which they have received to hold, as washing of cups and pots and brazen vessels and tables. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, Why walk not your disciples according to the tradition of the elders? See, they're even admitting that their commandment is a tradition of the elders. It's not Torah itself. But eat bread with unwashen hands. He answered and said unto them, Well has Isaiah prophesied of you, hypocrites, as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching the doctrine and the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, and the washing of pots and cups, and many other such things you do. And he said unto them, Full well you reject the commandment of God, that you keep your own tradition. So Yeshua was saying to the Pharisees, you know what? You're placing your commandments, your traditions, your man-made customs and traditions above the Torah commandments itself. And he was implying, and many times, you nullify God's own commandments by your traditions. He goes on to prove his point. For Moses said, Honor your father and your mother, and whoever curses father or mother, let him die the death. But you say, if a man shall say to his father and mother, It is Corban, in other words, that is to say, it's a gift to God, by whatsoever thou mightest profit by me, he shall be free. In other words, honoring your parents meant giving your material substance to help your parents out when they retire, when they're in the golden years of their life, when they're frail and can't work for themselves. But if somebody says, all this stuff that I meant for you, I'm going to give to God and dedicate to God, they're free from their obligation, according to the traditions of men, to take care of their parents. And so Yeshua went on to say, And you suffer him no more to do aught for his father and mother, making the word of God of none effect through your tradition, which you have delivered, and many such things as these. So Matthew 19:19 says, Honor thy father and thy mother, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So God doesn't need our material gifts. To truly love and worship God, we're not to say, oh, I'm going to give you this and just disregard caring for my parents. No, honor your parents. That's how you honor God. So let's continue on. So let me ask you, most of us live in the Western world, whether it be the United States or Canada or Europe. What makes the Western world free? What makes these free countries? Is it not the laws that make these countries free? It's the laws that make these countries free, because laws are set up in place to protect the citizens of these countries so that they will not be murdered, robbed, cheated, or that there wouldn't be total chaos and anarchy. It protects them in so many ways. So the laws that are set up in the place safeguard the citizens to be safe and to live happy and productive and prosperous lives. And it's those people who break these laws who cause the common people to suffer, because they do steal and kill the common people. So it's the laws that make these countries free. It's the laws that make North America free. We abide by these laws, and therefore we live in a free country where we are guaranteed the right of happiness and the pursuit of happiness and things of this nature. So, looking at the law in regards to the Western world, we don't see the law as a bondage. We see it as a freedom. That's why we are free countries, because we have laws set in place. So we don't see law as a negative or a negative connotation as people see the law of God in regards to religion. So, God is oftentimes called himself a king. And we read in the Brit Hadashah, the renewed covenant, the New Testament, that Yeshua has a kingdom. That Yeshua is God's son. He is the prince. God is the king, and therefore Yeshua is also the spiritual king, because he's a descendant of God. He's the son of God, but he's also a physical king in the line of David, having the right to rule Israel and Judah. So therefore, he is a king. So if God and Yeshua are kings, then logic dictates that they must have a kingdom. And if they have a kingdom, logic further dictates that they must have kingdom law in which the kingdom operates by, and which the kings rule by. This law is none other than the Torah, God's laws, God's instructions. So the Exodus is what gave birth to the kingdom. It's what gave birth to a nation. A nation must have structure, law, and order. So in the Greek, it's called ekklesia, and in the Hebrew, it's called kahal. It means an assembly that has been called out. So we see that Israel was called out of Egypt and therefore became a nation. And even they were called the church, or the ecclesia, in the wilderness, the called out assembly in the wilderness. Acts 7:38 says, "This is he that was in the church in the wilderness, with the angel which spake to him in the Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, who received the lively oracles given to us." So Acts chapter 2 is not the birth of the church. The birth of the church happened when Israel came out of bondage of Egypt and left in the Exodus. They were called the church in the wilderness, the called out assembly in the wilderness. So we've already discussed how Protestant Christianity, Christendom at large, Catholicism views the Torah, the law, the instructions of God, that it is negative, that it is a bondage, that it's been done away with, that it's obsolete, that Yeshua did away with it. But how do Jews view the law? Traditionally, Jewish people view the Torah, God's instructions, God's laws, as wedding vows. Would you ever consider your wedding vows a bondage? No, you consider them safeguard and protection for the integrity of your marriage. So Deuteronomy 32:47a says, "For it is not a vain thing for you, because it is your life." So when you marry somebody, you give your life to that person. You dedicate your entire life to that person. And you dedicate your life to that person by the pronunciation of these marital vows, that you will care, love, and provide for them no matter what the circumstances. It'll be unconditional, that you will remain faithful and stay faithful to that person maritally and sexually, and keep the integrity of your marriage. John 10:10b says, "I come that you might have life, and that you might have it more abundantly." So the Jewish people and the Hebrew people look at the law, the Torah, the instructions of God, as marriage vows, as wedding vows. So if sexual immorality and unfaithfulness, sleeping around with other persons besides your spouse, is considered being unfaithful to your marriage, what is being faithful to God? Not worshiping idols, not running around on him and seeking other religions and other idols and other gods. And so the Jews view the Torah as their life, giving their life over to God as marital vows. We see that Yeshua in John chapter 1, if you read it carefully, that Yeshua is the living manifestation of the written Torah. He is called the Word. So the law, the Torah of God, is definitely and by no means a bondage. So what does the law have to do with believers in Messiah Yeshua? Exodus 12:38 says, "And a mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds, and very much cattle." So when Israel left Egypt, it wasn't just the 12 tribes that went off into the wilderness. It was a mixed multitude of people that went with them that were living in Egypt, or that they were trading in Egypt, or they were also slaves in Egypt. And it is believed by the rabbis and sages that this mixed multitude consisted of the 70 root nations that made up the world. So when the children of Israel, the 12 tribes, were at the foot of Mount Sinai receiving the law of God from Mount Sinai through Moses, the mixed multitude was there too. And Exodus 19:8 says, "And all the people answered together," all the people, including the mixed multitude, they were there too, "and said, All that Adonai, all that God, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto Adonai." So to say that the law is just for the Jews, just for the Hebrew people, just for the 12 tribes, is a falsehood. It is a lie, because not only did the children of Israel, the 12 tribes, the Jews and the Hebrews, accept the law of God upon themselves, also the mixed multitude, which represents the 70 root nations of the world. So not only the law was given to the Jews, which they are the primary recipients and caretakers of the law, but it was also given to mankind. It was also given to the Gentiles. So the law is not only for the Jews, but the law is also for the Gentiles. Because the mixed multitude, they represent the 70 root nations. So just as all the Jewish and Hebrew people around the world says our ancestors were there and received the law of God at Mount Sinai, every Gentile can say that too, because their DNA was there. One of their descendants of the 70 root nations was there at the foot of Mount Sinai receiving the law on the Gentiles' behalf. So you may ask, well, what about the Noahide laws? That says that only Gentiles is only supposed to keep the Noahide laws. The Noahide laws are not found anywhere in Scripture. They are extrapolated from Scripture, yes, but they are a rabbinic invention to keep the Torah exclusively for the Jews, therefore excluding the Gentiles. And we see that Yeshua had a big problem of this, because there was a court of the Gentiles in the temple that was perverted into a marketplace of selling sacrificial animals, therefore keeping the Gentiles away from Torah, away from God, away from prayer. And Yeshua beat out the money changers because it wasn't right. So the law is not just for the Jews, it is for the Gentiles as well. Let me read Exodus 19:5 through 8. It says, "Now therefore, if you will obey my voice, indeed, and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel." And Moses came and called the elders of the people, and laid before their faces all the words which Adonai commanded him. And all that the people answered together and said, "All that Adonai the Lord hath spoken, we will do." And Moses returned the words of the people unto Adonai. So Israel and Gentile accepted the Torah even before they heard the details of what the Torah was. Now, we read here that it was kind of like, it sounded like Moses was addressing the children of Israel and excluding the Gentiles. But if we read the Torah carefully, it says that anybody that decides to join themselves to Israel, join themselves to the people of Israel and to her God, they become part of the commonwealth of Israel. Therefore, one law is for the Jew and the Gentile alike. There is no double standard. So not only this, but we see that Yeshua himself, the Messiah himself, the Son of God himself, said that he didn't come to do away with the law of Moses, to do away with God's instructions. For it says in Matthew 5:17 through 20, "Think not," don't even let the thought cross your mind, "think not that I've come to destroy the Torah," the law, "or the prophets." Now the law and the prophets together make up what the Jews call the Tanakh, what Christians would call the Old Testament. So you have the Torah, law, T, you have the Nevi'im, which means prophets, and then you have the Ketuvim, which means writings, and this is things such as Lamentations and Ruth and Esther and Proverbs and Psalms. So they made an acronym called the Tanakh, which is what we call, what Jewish people or the Christian people call the Old Testament. So think not that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets, the Torah or the Tanakh. I'm not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Now this word has caused much consternation and confusion, but if you look at the Greek and Aramaic, that word fulfill doesn't mean to do so you don't have to do it anymore. Fulfill means to bring into its full and complete meaning so that you understand it in order to carry it out yourself. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, I'm just looking out the window, making sure that heaven and earth are still there. They're still there, trust me. It says, till heaven and earth pass, not one jot, which is the smallest Hebrew letter, which is called yud, not one yud or one stroke. Some translations say tittle. That is the artistic flair on any given Hebrew letter. Till heaven and earth pass away, not one yud or one stroke shall no wise pass from the Torah, till all be fulfilled, till all comes into its full and complete meaning and understanding and obedience. Whosoever therefore shall break one of the least of these commandments, and you can find the least of the commandments in Deuteronomy 22, 6 through 7, and we'll get into that, and teach men to break these least of the commandments, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So Yeshua here is promoting the teaching and the obedience of Torah to Jew and Gentile alike. For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Boy, they kept to the letters of the law. But the problem was they kept to the letter of the law outwardly, not inwardly. They did all the right motions outwardly, but inwardly they didn't. And that's the difference. You have to keep the law inwardly and let it manifest outwardly. So the point was made that thou shalt not commit adultery. A lot of Pharisees are saying, hey, great, easy. I've never jumped in bed with anybody but my wife, so I've not committed adultery. But Yeshua said, if you look on a woman to lust after her, you've committed adultery in your heart already. So he upped the ante to the obedience of the law. Not only do you have to keep it physically, outwardly, but you have to keep it inwardly in your heart and in your mind. For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, ye shall in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven. Moving on. Adonai and Messiah are one, according to John 6:4 and John chapter 1 and John chapter 17. So God and Yeshua, Father and Son, are one. They're echad. They're one in unity. They're one in plurality. So therefore, the laws of the Father, which is the Torah, is the same as the laws of the Son, Messiah. Because a son never supersedes the authority of his father. He always obeys his father and does what his father says and does what his father does. So you can't say that there are laws of Christ and laws of God. You can't say that they're two juxtaposed, two totally different things. The laws of God and the laws of Christ, the laws of Messiah, are the exact same thing. There is no difference. And what is the law of God and what is the law of Messiah? The Torah. The 5 books of Moses, the 613 commandments, the instructions of God. So now we talked about the least of the commandments, Deuteronomy 22, 6 through 7. According to the rabbis and sages, this is the least of the commandments. If a bird's nest chance to be before thee in the way, in a tree, or on the ground, whether they be young ones or eggs, and the dam, or the female bird, the mother bird, sitting upon the young or upon the eggs, you shall not take the mother bird with the young, but you shall any wise let the mother bird go, and take the young to thee, that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest prolong thy days. So in other words, if you see a bird nursing young or on eggs, you're not to take both the mother and the bird and kill them and eat them and destroy them all together. You're to let the mother bird go so she can further reproduce and have more eggs and more babies, but you're permitted to take the young or the eggs. That is the least of the commandments according to the rabbis and sages. And what is the greatest? Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And Yeshua said there is a second commandment, which is equal to the first. Love your neighbor as yourself. So therefore, now you have the least and the greatest commandment. Now you know what these parameters are. So we will continue on in the next segment, part 2 of God's laws and instructions. Has the law been done away with? Thank you for watching. Shalom and Shavua Tov.